Hey everyone, this is a foreword to Debord by Anselm Jappe. The foreword is by T.J. Clark, and it's from May 1998. I'm also going to read the translator's acknowledgments at the end of this. So here we go. A book about Debord and Anselm Jappe's is far and away the best we have so far, I think. Ultimately stands or falls by what it has to say about two interlinked puzzles that stand at the heart of Debord's life and work. Such a book need not spell out these puzzles exactly as I do. You will see that Jappe's terms are different, but I believe it ought to be driven and haunted, as Jappe's undoubtedly is, by a similar sense that broad questions about the nature of Debord's achievements constantly come up and get harder to answer the more unavoidable they seem. The questions are these. First, how are we to understand the obvious but scandalous fact that in Debord's case politics was largely writing, that it turned on the building of an intimidable, polemical, and expository style, assembled over decades, born from a series of engagements with, on and against the French language. Second, what does it mean that this, the only political writing of our time, the only such writing to have a chance of surviving its circumstances, I believe, the writing that will be seen by future ages to have kept the possibility of politics alive, issued from a situation so thoroughly at odds with the century, or with most of the terms in which the century chose to present itself? Why was distance and embattlement, of which Debord was the ultimate exponent, so often the source of insight and insanity in his case, not, quote, paradise for a sect, end quote? What does it tell us about the age that its true voice, its adequate description, came so exultantly from the margins? Because Jappe succeeds in posing these two questions concurrently and knows full well that answering one of them involves answering both, he manages to talk about Debord's achievement as one of voice or language without falling in with those in France who have been trying since Debord's death and even before Debord's death to turn Debord into a, quote, master of French prose, end quote. At all events, the maneuver is futile. For a start, part of the work on the language of Debord was involved in turns For a start, part of the work on the language Debord was involved in turns on an agonized and deeply funny running battle with the notions of mastery and the Frenchness lurking in the phrase above, quote, mastery, end quote, equaling, quote, Frenchness, end quote. Quote, mastery equaling, quote, Frenchness, end quote, which in turn equals clarity, authority, classical balance, skeptical levity, etc. A great deal of the agony/comedy in Debord's prose is provided by the business of its continually swallowing and half regurgitating monstrous Hegelian, un-French, unclear terms of phrase and thought, so that the reader is typically plunged in a sentence or two from icy Retz or La Rochefoucauld aphorisms shining with hate-filled economy onto smothering, fuzzy, inspiring rigmarole, full of unrepentant dialectical tricks like the best bits of Feuerbach or the young Marx, and there is no, quote, like, end quote, about it a lot of the time. The quotations and paraphrases are verbatim. Jappe tracks many of these down. This is, quote, writing, end quote. Sure enough, I'd be inclined to say great writing, but it was not done by someone who was only or essentially a writer or a master of French prose, any more than he was a, quote, artist, quote, filmmaker, quote, politician, or even, quote, revolutionary. All these identities Debord never tired of telling us are what now stand in the way of the activities they once pointed to. Political writing of the highest order is rare, moments at which a particular language is open to a further range of possibilities, a new tone, a new conception of human purposes, a sharper or wilder rhetorical accent, in any case happen infrequently, and moments at which this opening depends on the creation of a specifically political voice rather than an ethical, lyric, or epic one are truly few and far between. The Rousseau of the discourses would be one, Burke in the Reflections another. The Debord-Rousseau comparison is inescapable, I think, even down to the confidence with which right-thinking commentators go on trying to reduce the politics of both to personal deficiency, thinking that Doing so will lay the politics finally to rest. That never quite seems to happen, but the fact that both my points of comparison come from the late 18th century only puts the Debord puzzle in sharper relief, for Burke and Rousseau were working with a political imagery and imagination already formed and enriched by many others in a previous half-century's conversation. They had seen the imagery and argumentation taken up in actual political practice by despots and revolutionaries and put to the test of reality. The terms of the conversation had changed constantly as a result. In a word, they were the least isolated of men. They did not need to invent a political language, still less to wrest the possibility of a political language from a surrounding farrago of lies and sound bites. They did not live in the midst of a terrible, interminable contest over how best to debauch and eviscerate the last memory, the last trace of political aspiration. Those who complain of Debord's paranoia should look again at what Debord was trying to do and what Debord might have thought in the 1970s and 1980s, that almost everything and everybody stood in his way. One main merit of Jappe's book is that it manages to see and speak to Debord's embattledness and isolation, and also to Debord being a social animal, for no one was better over whole stretches of his life at making himself enough of a community for the purposes of the moment, and if that community had nothing to do with the official, quote, political, end quote, culture of Sartre, Garridi, and de Gaulle, then so much the better. Writing was one social activity among others. The room on the Rue Saint-Jacques, where the Society of the Spectacle got written, was at once an austere cell with nothing on the shelves, I remember, but a few crucial texts, Hegel, Pascal, Marx, Lukács, Luchamon's poésie, laid open at the relevant page, and the entryway to Debord's minuscule apartment, through which friends and comrades continually passed. The process was meant to be seen and interrupted. One moment the deep ventriloquial dialogue with history and class consciousness, the next the latest bubble for a comic détourné, or the best insult yet to Althusser and Godard. These names lead me finally to Debord's hostility to the very idea of, quote, representation, end quote, which everyone these days, except Jappe, is supposed to think the weirdest and most naive part of his worldview. For what else can there be, says everyone, besides representation? What could Debord possibly have meant by the notions brought on in his writing to represent representations opposite, quote, lived experience, end quote, for instance, or, quote, imagination, end quote, or worse still, quote, poetry, end quote? Do they not lead us inevitably back to a Rousseau and Lukács realm of transparency and face-to-faceness, and therefore usher in a politics of purity and purging to match? Not necessarily, in Jappe's answer. In the end, in our present age of, quote, information, end quote, it may even be this side of Debord's politics, for the moment the most despised, the most outdated, that will prove the kernel of future action. For supposing we take Debord's writing as directed not to anathematizing representation in general as everyone has it, but proposing certain tests for truth and falsity in representation, and above all for truth and falsity in representational regimes. Why should there not be an alternative to our current, quote, totalitarian dictatorship of the fragment, end quote? Why is it so difficult to think and demand and construct, quote, representations, end quote, as plural rather than as singular and centralized, representations as so many fields of terrain of activity subject to leakage and interference between modes and technologies, and constantly crossed and dispersed by other kinds of activity altogether, subject as a result to retrieval and cancellation, to continual reversals of direction between object and image and receiver? Why should a regime of representation not be built on the principle that images are? Excuse me, I'm going to get a drink real quick. Images are, or ought to be, transformable as opposed to exchangeable. Meaning disposable through and through, and yet utterly material and contingent, shareable, imaginable, coming up constantly in their negativity, their non-identity, and for that reason promoted and dismantled at will. Quote, history, end quote, to take up one of Debord's favorite quotations from Lukács, quote, is the history of the unceasing overthrow of the objective forms that shape the life of man, end quote. I know that in the age of symbol management, it is sometimes hard to tell Debord's utopia apart from the one on offer from Microsoft, but they are different in every respect. The one is a nerveless parody of the other, and the fact that Debord's imagining of other worlds shares so much with that of his opponents is potentially his imagining's strong point. It is what lets the Society of the Spectacle go on haunting the non-world of cyberspace until the moment, which is surely not far off, when the bourgeoisie begins to fall out of love with the speed-up of the last 2 decades and no longer gets higher and higher on the details, the gadgetry of its own proletarianization. Political writing is always instrumental as well as utopian. Debord's is no exception. Only sometimes writing has to reconcile itself to the idea that its time of instrumentality, its time as a weapon, lies as a battle in the future. Jappe's book is true to its subject above all because it reads Debord and helps us read Debord with that future in mind. T.J. Clark, May 1998. Translator's Acknowledgements. I wish to thank Bruce Elwell and John Simmons for reading the translation manuscript and offering help on many points. Thomas Y. Levin graciously supplied me with some hard-to-find documents. To Mia Rublovska, I am indebted for all kinds of aid, tangible and intangible. Above all, I must express my gratitude to Anselm Jappe, who reviewed the text with me word by word and displayed seemingly inexhaustible patience in dealing with my queries. This English-language edition embodies the author's latest revisions. Needless to say, however, all shortcomings of translation should be laid at my door. Donald Nicholson Smith, that's the translator's name. It just says DNS. I thank you all for listening. I have now completely finished reading this book. I'm going to tell you, it's a good one. I think people who think critically about capitalism today could learn a lot from Guy Debord and also from Anselm Jappe and the traditions the different traditions that they came from and influenced. So, value criticism in the case of Anselm Jappe, and the legacy of situationism and Hegelian Marxism from Guy Debord. Sorry, I'm spacing out because I've just been reading for 4 hours, so my mind's scrambled. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.